When the courtroom doors swung open, everyone thought he'd mistaken the building for the nightclub, where his father bought his way into politics. When the courtroom doors swung open, everyone thought he'd mistaken the building for the nightclub, where his father bought his way into politics. The young man who stepped inside moved like someone entering a space designed only for him. Chin raised, shoulders loose, confidence dripping like an expensive cologne. His clothes were loud enough to clash with the modest walls of the Providence Traffic Tribunal. A designer jacket that didn't know the difference between a runway and a municipal chamber. Sunglasses he didn't bother removing. A phone lifted high, recording everything. He aimed the camera at himself, speaking loudly enough for those in the back row to hear, "Ladies and gentlemen, watch this. The most famous TikTok judge is about to handle my case." A few older men in the gallery exchanged looks, those quiet, knowing glances of people who've spent lifetimes working for every dollar. A woman with silver hair tapped her cane once, disapprovingly. No one said a word aloud, but the message was clear. Another entitled kid playing celebrity in a place meant for responsibility. He strutted past them without a flicker of acknowledgement, as if human beings were part of the stage design for his live stream. The phone stayed up, capturing every step, every smirk. Judge Caprio looked up slowly. The room settled around him, the way it always did, calm, respectful, carrying decades of trust. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded, his expression unreadable. "Please state your name," he said, tone even. The young man smiled into his camera, then lowered his glasses enough to show the judge the sharp, confident eyes of someone who had never been told no. "You really need it?" he asked. "Come on. You know who my father is." A ripple moved through the audience. Soft gasps. Quiet disbelief. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the assumption that hierarchy mattered here, that influence could be inherited like a luxury watch. Judge Caprio didn't blink. He didn't answer immediately either. Instead, he looked not at the young man, but through him, as if seeing a boy wearing the clothes of a man he wasn't ready to be. Then, in a calm voice that slid through the room like a sudden shift in air pressure, he delivered the first blow to the young man's inflated ego. "In this courtroom, no one's name carries more weight than their actions." The smirk faltered. Not much, just enough for the people in the gallery to feel the tilt. Enough for the camera to catch the first micro-crack in his self-assurance. It wasn't the parking violation that mattered anymore. Everyone sensed it. This case had just turned into something else. Something heavier. The kind of moment older Americans recognize from a lifetime of watching pride collide with truth. A quiet fell over the room. Not forced, but natural. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they're about to witness a lesson being written in real time. And the judge, still composed, waited. Not for a name, but for the young man's first honest reaction. The judge's question lingered in the air. Simple, procedural, but it pressed directly against the young man's carefully inflated image. "Do you admit to the violation?" Caprio asked. The young man shifted his weight, rolling his shoulders as if trying to loosen invisible restraints. He lifted his chin again, but the earlier swagger didn't land quite as cleanly. "I shouldn't even be here," he said, almost scoffing. Not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the room. A retired firefighter in the front row let out a quiet breath, the kind older men exhale when they recognize a familiar type. The child of money who's never needed to stand alone. Caprio watched him with measured patience. He had seen impatience, arrogance, frustration, but this was something else. A hollowness disguised as confidence. A young man performing a role he didn't fully understand. The camera, still clutched in his hand, stayed pointed down now. He wasn't filming anymore, though he pretended he might start again at any second. His thumb hovered near the screen, not touching it, almost guarding it. A nervous habit disguised as distraction. Caprio spoke again, gently but unmistakably direct. Do you realize your behavior is being broadcast to the world? By you, not by this court? For the first time, the young man hesitated. A brief, flickering pause. Then he did something the gallery didn't expect. He tapped the screen and ended the stream. The abrupt silence that followed was louder than the voice he'd used moments earlier. Without the digital spotlight, he looked smaller, like someone who had lost the script mid-performance. Under the courtroom lights, away from the glow of his followers, subtler truths appeared. His expensive jacket didn't hide the tension in his shoulders. His jaw tightened as if bracing for an impact he couldn't predict. He wasn't cruel, just unformed. Raised in a world where consequences were outsourced, where doors opened before he reached them. His father, a developer whose name surfaced often in local disputes, zoning fights, environmental complaints, neighborhood clashes, had built an empire on bending rules. And his son had grown up believing rules were suggestions that didn't apply to people like him. Caprio's gaze lowered briefly to the case file. Temporary plates. Registered in another state. Not in the young man's name. He noted everything without comment. Meanwhile, the young man's fingers tightened around his phone. His foot tapped once against the carpet. Barely audible, but enough to reveal the pressure building beneath the surface. He wasn't angry. He was cornered by a situation he couldn't outsource to an assistant or hand off to a lawyer. His eyes darted briefly toward the exit, as if checking whether leaving was even an option. Then, realizing it wasn't, he looked back at Caprio, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his posture lacked the shield of entitlement. The judge leaned back slightly, studying him, not judging, just observing the quiet unraveling of a young man who had spent years mistaking privilege for strength. Outside, the violation was just a parking issue. Inside, something more delicate and more dangerous was unfolding. A young man confronting the limits of inherited power. Judge Caprio lifted the thin folder again, sliding a page free with the deliberate calm of someone accustomed to finding truth in small details. The young man watched, trying to look indifferent, but the slightest tremor in his knee betrayed him. "Let me ask you something," Caprio said, eyes moving from the document back to the defendant. "Can you confirm this vehicle is yours?" The answer came too quickly, reflexive, unconsidered. "Yeah, of course, it's mine." A few people in the gallery straightened in their seats. The speed of the reply was wrong. Too automatic. Too easy. The judge, who had listened to thousands of voices over decades, caught the false note immediately. He placed the paper flat on the bench. "Then explain," he said, "why the temporary plates are from another state, and why they were issued to someone with no legal connection to Rhode Island." It was not an accusation. It was a door swinging open onto something the young man desperately hoped would stay hidden. He froze. The gallery fell utterly silent. Even the hum of the air vent seemed to fade. For several seconds he didn't move. Not a blink, not a breath deep enough to mask the shock. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the earlier smoothness. I can use any car people let me borrow." "Borrow?" Caprio repeated, the word gently lifted, not mocked. The young man nodded quickly, then too quickly. "Yeah, I mean, people trust me. They know who my father is." He meant it as reassurance, but the line landed with a dull thud. A retired teacher in the second row whispered, "Oh boy," before catching herself. No one laughed. No one smiled. The tension had turned the room into glass. Caprio leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the bench. "I'm not asking about permission," he said. "I'm asking about honesty." The young man's throat moved in a hard swallow. He tried to recover, but the words tangled. "I don't have to explain every detail." That sentence, the tone, the defiance, shifted the entire atmosphere. It wasn't just rude. It revealed something deeper, a belief that the courtroom existed beneath him, that the people around him were merely spectators to his immunity. A young mother with a stroller in the back row exchanged a look with an older man beside her. Everyone felt it. The mask was slipping, and what showed underneath wasn't confidence after all. It was fear wrapped in entitlement. Caprio didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the moment hang. His silence carried weight, the kind earned through years of guiding people back toward truth, even when they tried to outrun it. When he finally did speak, his tone was measured, but firmer than before. "Young man," he said, "the truth isn't an optional courtesy in this room." The defendant's fingers tightened around his phone until the knuckles whitened. His gaze darted toward the file in the judge's hands, trying to guess what else might be in it. He had walked in thinking he owned the moment. Now he was fighting to keep his balance. The gallery sensed the shift. This was no longer about a parking violation. This was about integrity, his and the lack of it. Caprio breathed in slowly, as if preparing to open another layer of the case. A layer the young man had hoped would never see daylight. And the courtroom, still frozen in silence, braced for whatever came next. A clerk approached the bench, quiet, efficient, sliding a fresh document toward Judge Caprio. The timing felt almost theatrical, though everyone knew this courtroom didn't stage moments. Information simply arrived when the system caught up. Caprio lifted the sheet, adjusting his glasses slightly. His eyes moved down the page, and his expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough for the front row to notice a subtle shift in gravity. He looked back at the young man. "Do you know the registered owner of the vehicle you were driving?" he asked. The question shouldn't have been difficult, but the young man didn't answer right away. The hesitation, thin, fragile, was a louder confession than any words. I mean, I know people at the company," he muttered. "That isn't what I asked." Caprio's voice carried no anger, only clarity. The young man licked his lips, searching for a version of the truth that could keep him insulated. "I guess I've heard of them," he said finally, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Caprio tapped the paper once. "This vehicle is registered to a corporation." A pause. "A corporation that has appeared in multiple state investigations regarding financial discrepancies." A ripple went through the gallery, soft, restrained, but undeniably present. The sort of collective intake of breath older Americans instinctively share when they sense that something small has just revealed something large. The young man stiffened. He swallowed hard, his posture suddenly rigid, as though bracing for impact. The judge continued, voice steady. "The address listed for the company matches the location of one of your father's development offices. That's not a coincidence. Would you care to explain how this car ended up in your possession?" The young man forced a laugh, a brittle, nervous sound that broke midway. "Those things are complicated. Paperwork gets mixed up all the time." No one believed it, not even him. He shifted his feet, as if the carpet had turned uneven beneath him. His hands hovered uncertainly, unable to decide whether to gesture or stay still. Every practiced mannerism of confidence had dissolved. Caprio read the next line silently, then set the document down. These temporary plates were issued 3 days before the company was cited for avoiding environmental compliance during one of their projects. This time, the reaction from the gallery wasn't a gasp. It was a heavy silence. A silence of recognition. A silence that said, "We've seen this pattern before." The young man's voice cracked when he tried to speak. That has nothing to do with me." Caprio leaned back, disappointment settling into the lines of his face. Not theatrical, but genuine, paternal. The kind of disappointment people over 60 know is far heavier than anger. "I'm not interrogating you," he said. "I'm trying to understand why a young man with every advantage in the world arrives in this courtroom driving a car that may be tied to a criminal scheme." The young man's facade ruptured. His breathing quickened, and for a fleeting second, his eyes darted toward the camera he had shut off earlier, almost craving its protection. He blurted out, "My father said I didn't need to worry about anything. He told me to just show up and let you do your little routine." The words echoed, reckless, revealing, unfiltered. People in the gallery shifted in their seats, stunned by the open disdain. Not toward the judge, toward the entire idea of accountability. Caprio closed the file with 2 fingers, a small, deliberate motion. Not dramatic, but final. The young man felt the weight of it immediately. The mask he'd worn into the courtroom hadn't just slipped, it had shattered. And for the first time since walking in, he understood. This was no longer a performance. This was truth catching up. The courtroom felt smaller now, as though the walls had inched inward without anyone noticing. The young man stood rigid, drained of the bravado he'd worn like armor just minutes earlier. His breathing had become shallow, uneven. Even his expensive jacket no longer looked bold, just misplaced. Judge Caprio folded his hands slowly, allowing the silence to settle. When he finally spoke, his tone carried a weight that didn't need volume. "I don't see a criminal standing in front of me," he said. "I see someone who's never been told no at the moment he needed it most." The young man blinked hard, absorbing the words like blows he didn't know how to deflect. His mouth opened, then closed again. He wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't even defending himself. Something inside him was cracking, quietly, painfully, in front of a room full of strangers. Caprio continued, voice steady but deeply human. "You're not here because of the car. You're here because life finally asked you to stand on your own feet. And for the first time, you don't have anyone to step in front of you." The gallery remained absolutely silent. No one shifted. No one murmured. Older men and women watched him with a mixture of sternness and compassion. People who had weathered harder storms, who knew the cost of avoiding responsibility. The young man swallowed, as though something lodged in his throat. When he finally spoke, the words tumbled out unevenly. "I didn't want to drive that car," he said. "I told him it felt wrong. But he said it didn't matter. He said to keep my head down and do what I'm told." His voice wavered, not with anger, but with something more fragile. Fear. Confusion. A dawning realization that the world he lived in wasn't nearly as secure as he'd believed. Caprio nodded gently. "I understand," he said. "But let me tell you something important." The judge leaned in slightly, his tone shifting from judicial to fatherly, the way he did when he sensed someone was standing at the edge of a lesson they'd remember for the rest of their life. "Your father gave you wealth. He gave you access. But he didn't give you freedom. Because freedom isn't money. It's accountability. You earn it by taking ownership of your choices, especially when it's uncomfortable." The young man's shoulders dropped, as if the fight had finally left him. His phone, his constant shield, hung loose in his hand, forgotten. Caprio's next words landed with the clarity of truth spoken without hostility. Today, for the first time, you're answering for something without a lawyer, without influence, without your father intervening. That makes you more of an adult than any status ever will. The young man lowered his eyes. He wasn't ashamed. He was awakened. Caprio concluded his ruling with a measured calm. For the parking violation itself, I'm issuing a minimal fine. You'll take care of it on your own. As for the vehicle, the information will be forwarded to the department responsible for temporary plates. They'll address what needs addressing. Not punishment, not leniency. Balance. The young man exhaled, a long, trembling breath, as though a weight he'd carried for years had suddenly shifted. The gallery remained still, sensing the gravitas of the moment. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a turning point. Caprio closed the file softly. "You have a chance to choose who you become," he said. "Don't waste it." The words seemed to reach him more deeply than anything his father had ever said. And for the first time since he'd entered the courtroom, he stood not as a privileged son, but as someone finally confronting his own reflection. When the ruling was finished, the young man didn't move right away. He stood still, as if taking inventory of a world that had quietly rearranged itself. The courtroom, moments ago a stage for his bravado, now felt like a place where he had finally been seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. He lifted his eyes to Judge Caprio, hesitated, then nodded once. No swagger, no camera, no smirk. Just a quiet acknowledgement that carried more sincerity than any apology he could have offered. He turned to leave, steps far slower than the strutting entrance he'd made earlier. The phone hung at his side like a deflated balloon, no longer a shield or a megaphone. As he reached the door, he stopped, glanced back, and said softly, "Thank you, Judge." It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished, but it was real. The gallery stayed silent, not out of indifference, but out of respect for the shift that had taken place. Older men with weathered hands, women who'd raised families through difficult decades, people who had spent a lifetime learning the value of humility. They watched him go without judgment. They understood that growth rarely announces itself with applause. Caprio observed him with a calm, steady gaze. His expression held neither triumph nor pity, only hope. When the door closed behind the young man, the judge murmured a line that carried the weight of decades on the bench. "Money doesn't make you great. The moments when you admit your mistakes do." The clerk began gathering documents. The next case waited. But something lingered in the air, a quiet truth that everyone in the room carried out with them. Outside, the young man stepped into the daylight. The brightness felt different, less like a backdrop for a live stream, more like a reality he'd have to navigate without filters or followers. He breathed in deeply, letting the crisp Providence air settle the tightness in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen. A message from his father. "Call me. Now." For a long moment, he didn't move. His thumb hovered, not with the uncertainty of a boy seeking approval, but with the hesitation of someone suddenly aware that he had a choice. He stared at the notification, at the name that had defined every decision made for him, and for the first time in his life, he questioned whether obedience was the same as loyalty, or merely convenience dressed as duty. The weight of the courtroom still pressed softly against his thoughts. Caprio's words about freedom, responsibility, adulthood. The truth he'd tried so hard to avoid now sat squarely on his shoulders. But it didn't crush him. It steadied him. He locked the phone without replying. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, watching traffic roll by, listening to the everyday sounds that didn't need an audience to matter. A bus pulled up. A man walked his dog. A couple argued softly about groceries. Ordinary life, unfiltered, unperformed, continued around him. And he wondered, genuinely, perhaps for the first time, do I want to keep living the life he set for me? Or the one I choose for myself? The question didn't have an answer yet, but the fact that he was finally asking it meant the story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. A narrator's voice would close the episode with the kind of measured wisdom viewers cherished. In every life, a moment arrives when you must choose whether to be part of the problem or part of the solution. Today, he felt that moment. Tomorrow, he decides what to do with it. The camera of his phone stayed dark, and for the first time, he didn't reach to turn it on.